Howdy folks, this is Bob Tauber, your instructor for online psychopathology, and I'm recording this tape for week number 9 in our class. This is an important week. One reason is because the final paper comes out. It's posted in the assignment section. And this final paper, I give you quite a bit of time to complete. It's worth 1/3 of the class credit, or 100 points. And you have all the way until the very end of week 11. So I add an extra week past the quarter if you need it. It can be submitted anytime between now, the beginning of week 9, and the end of week 11. And after that, I really have to have it. It's a final deadline because I have a deadline myself to submit your end of quarter evaluations. So what I want to do is just, enhance the instructions, and there are detailed instructions in the week 9 conversation forum on this final paper, where you'll be outlining and getting feedback from your fellow students on the character you've chosen to focus on for the final paper, and your thoughts about the clinical workup you're going to be doing. So this is going to be posted in that, and also this video will also be attached in the assignment section with the final paper assignment. So in both cases, what I'm looking to do is typically I've had live meetings. Even in online classes, I've offered voluntary live meetings to go over this final paper. But given this current circumstances, my choice was to either do a Zoom meeting or do a video for you, and I decided to do a video. I know that you've had lots and lots of Zoom meetings, and I thought this might be a better way. So anyhow, this final paper is really sort of a capstone paper. By that I mean is it takes the material from the quarter and has you apply it to an actual case study. So just as a reminder, this class is called Psychopathology, the Biopsychosocial Model of Mental Disorders. And I went over this in the very first week of the class, and basically what I said is that the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, before 1980 was pretty much named a diagnosis and then had a paragraph describing it that usually sort of had a slant in one direction in terms of the philosophy behind the mental disorder. And up to that point, it was mostly, you'd call it Freudian or psychoanalytic. Now, nothing against Freud and psychoanalysis. You may really agree with that way of looking at how we function, our psyche. But the point is it eliminated a lot of mental health professionals. So with the DSM-3 in 1980 and this biopsychosocial model, there was an attempt to create a nosology, a naming system for mental disorders that all different disciplines in mental health could use, and could be used across, but from social workers, family therapists, licensed professional clinical counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists. It was just made in a completely different way. And as you know now, since you've studied virtually all of the DSM, that it was based on creating criteria, specific criteria, not a philosophical description of a particular mental disorder, but criteria that would define that mental disorder. So the biopsychosocial model is about trying to get a model that people could agree on. When you say somebody has a panic disorder, that people across city lines, county lines, state lines, even country lines internationally, could, if they're going to use the term panic disorder, they're all talking about the same approximate presentation. And as it turned out, it kind of worked, because panic disorder used to have very poor inter-diagnostician reliability. People didn't agree on what exactly a panic disorder was. But once this new model came out in 1980, and really it is the same model now with some revisions, but the same way of looking at things, suddenly there was 90% agreement on what panic disorder means, simply because the criteria were listed. So just as a real quick review on this model, what this model says is that clients present with issues in their life, struggles in their life of all sorts and different kinds across health issues, economic issues, interpersonal issues, family, spousal issues. But the thing that really defines mental disorders, it goes sort of beyond the issues to the symptoms that they're experiencing. Symptoms meaning a depressed mood, or a symptom being a panicky experience, a panic attack, or a symptom being a manic episode, a very extremely high mood that also usually was accompanied with thinking that the person could do things that were reasonable or really accomplishable. Sorry for that word. But people present with symptoms of all different sorts, and those symptoms come together in different patterns, and those patterns will define diagnoses. And so, again, this is a bit of a repeat, but let me just go over this and describe this for you. This part right here is really what the DSM is about. All the DSMs from the 3 forward to the 5 now. It's the rule book and handbook for converting patterns of symptoms and their presentation. So their presentation in terms of severity, their presentation in terms of time, how long they've lasted, and looking at those patterns and finding a diagnosis, naming a diagnosis that fits a particular pattern. So in the diagnoses, in the DSM, it's divided into different chapters that clump together similar symptom patterns. So there are chapters that primarily deal with anxiety-type diagnoses. There are patterns that deal mostly with trauma-type diagnoses. There are patterns of symptoms that fold into more mood diagnoses, both the up and down moods of the bipolar diagnoses, and also major depression. There are patterns for maladaptive personality traits, and those are your personality disorders. There's chapters for people who are having dissociative experiences where their consciousness is fragmented, not due to any clear physical brain damage, but is fragmented most often due to traumatic experiences, and that's where you get multiple personality dissociative disorder. But there's a dissociative section, there's a section on sexuality and so forth. You've been reviewing those as this class has gone on. And so then to go on why it's called the biopsychosocial model is that the idea is that there's there's etiologies or causes driving the symptoms and folding into the diagnosis. And those causes are looked at. I don't know whether you could see me here. I'm going to write it as biologically based, biological, psychological, and social causes. And the idea of this model also is that when you look at this side, which is treatments, there are also treatments in the biological realm, psychological realm, and social realm. Now, some people would add a spiritual etiology, especially if you're into a 12-step community, in terms of not being right in line with a higher power, and potentially look at a treatment that way. But the model that's used in the DSM is biopsychosocial, so that's what we're using for this class. So what is this final paper? Let me get to that. What the final paper is that you're going to choose a character who is not a person you know, not a client you know, not yourself. A character who is either fictional, and that fictional character might be from a movie or a book or any kind of legend that you've heard of. A fictional character or a non-fictional character, which is a public figure usually, somebody who's been written about in history, somebody who is a public figure currently that you could read about in media sources. And you're going to choose that character, and you're going to do this workup for your character. That's the final paper. So what you're going to do is you're going to identify what you're going to be that character's therapist. And you're really writing about them in the past, and when you saw them. So that client came to you, and when they came to you, you did a workup of the symptoms that they were experiencing. You looked at the potential etiologies, biological, psychological, and social, that might be driving the symptoms. You were also then folding those symptoms into the diagnoses that seemed to fit the best. So you were listing diagnosis or diagnoses that you ruled in diagnosis. And you're going to talk about why you ruled in the specific diagnosis that you chose, or diagnoses. And then you're also going to talk about ruled out diagnosis. Diagnoses that seem close, might fit, but didn't quite fit, and the reason why you ruled those out. And then you're going to be talking about treatments, the treatments that you're going to use for your character. So just some characters that people have done. I mean, you could choose any fictional character, and in fact, on the instructions for the paper and in week 9's forum, there's a list of movies that a psychologist put together that has 200 movies listed that have characters in them who you can make the case that has a mental disorder, is demonstrating a mental disorder. So that's an important point. The character you choose, you want to choose somebody that you can make a case really has a diagnosable mental disorder, so to make this easy for you to do. If it's a client who's really not presenting with severe enough symptoms to make a diagnosis, then you really can't do this paper. So people have chosen clients that go all the way from Batman / Bruce Wayne, given the two personality presentations. People have chosen clients who seem to be presenting with, multiple personalities, like a movie like Split, or people have chosen clients who presented with things that look more like psychotic or manic states, like if you've ever seen The Fisher King, the Robin Williams character in that, or the Jeff Bridges character in that movie, who seems to present with sort of a chronic depression and substance use problems. So these are examples of from movies of characters people have chosen. In terms of non-fictional characters, I've been teaching this class a long time, and often the first choice is somebody who's getting a lot of press at the time. So we're now in the era of Trump, so undoubtedly somebody will choose Trump. I expect that. But it's way back in the past, people had chosen O.J. Simpson. They had chosen, I'm trying to think of other characters. Oh, they might have chosen a character who made the news for doing something that was criminal and got them into jail, and then it was discovered that they really had a serious mental illness. So that's the kind of, those are the kind of non-fictional characters. You could be really creative. I had somebody choose Eeyore from the Winnie the Pooh group of characters. Eeyore is the donkey who's always chronically kind of depressed. I think the diagnosis given was persistent depressive disorder. But they got so into Eeyore that they ended up doing, you don't have to do this, but they ended up doing all the characters in the Pooh group. So they did Winnie the Pooh the bear, who had some sort of eating disorder. He's obsessed with honey. And they did Tigger, who's the tiger who's bouncing off the walls, who they ended up diagnosing as, I think, bipolar, probably bipolar 1, some sort of, or it could have been attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But that's, these fictional clients just need to be characters who are your client, who you can make a case for having a mental disorder. So what you're going to do is you're going to do a workup of the symptoms that they're presenting with when you saw them. Best to talk about the symptoms when they were at their most severe, when they were at their worst. And you're going to be using that brief psychiatric rating scale, BPRS, that we studied in week 2 to do a workup of the symptoms. And you're also going to be presenting a history of the client. And so you could write that up, as you'll see in the instructions, any way you'd like. A brief history. And finally, you're going to be presenting something called the mental status exam. Now, I don't expect you to remember this, but the mental status exam was actually in some reading that was suggested that you read way back. It was either, I think it was week 2. And the mental status exam is discussed in the textbook, which I uploaded for you in the resources section, which is Essential Psychopathology and Its Treatment by Maxman and Ward. And a mental status exam is how that client presented when you first met them as their therapist. And it goes on for many, many pages. It's their appearance and their behavior and their speech, their mood and affect. This all starts on page 3132 in chapter 2 on your resources section of Essential Psychopathology. Thought processes and content, perception, their attention, concentration, their orientation, their memory. Some of these things cross over with the brief psychiatric rating scale, but it's broader. The mental status exam, often known as the MSE. So you'll be doing a mental status exam, the brief psychiatric rating scale, identifying the symptoms that are most prominent in the clinical range or in the acute range. Those scores, just as a reminder, when you look at the BPRS again, are 4 or 5s. That's the clinical range, meaning they suggest treatment is needed, or the acute range, the 6 and 7. But also you're going to be creating a history. Another character that just comes to mind just now is Howard Hughes from the movie The Aviator. What happened is that even from simply a Wikipedia source, you could get a lot of history about Howard Hughes. But there are characters you might do. You might choose a character from the movie The Fight Club. People have chosen a character from The Fight Club. You don't really have the history in the movie, but you need a history. So one thing it says in the instructions, and I want to make this really clear, is that if you're missing pieces of history that you really need in order to do this workup, that you can actually fabricate that history. And I'm not saying you fabricate everything about the client. You're really doing a BPRS based on the symptoms they present, and you're really doing a mental status exam in the way you would assume you would interview them in your office. But the brief history, you might need to know the client's family background, what their family was about, and it's never touched on in either for a fictional or non-fictional character. So what you could do is you could create and fill in the blanks of that history, and that's fine. That's fine if that makes it easier for you to do the process of shifting from symptoms to diagnosis. You know, you can create the fact that they had parents and one of their parents passed away and it was a huge stressor for them. It maybe didn't happen, but we don't know. So it's okay to fill in the history a bit, you know, if that makes sense. Write the actual history as much as you can, and if you need components that are missing, make them up. Hopefully that's understandable. So anyhow, after you go through this process of doing this assessment of symptoms and history and how they presented, you'll be doing the diagnosis with the rule-ins and rule-outs, and then you're going to be looking at etiologies and treatments. So I think I'm going to pause this first part of the tape and go on to a second part because this has gone long enough. So that's the end of part 1.